Tales of heroes are not just limited to movies. There are some real-life heroes who saved many lives in their career as a pilot against all odds. In this video, we have compiled some of the most brave attempts to save a sinking plane, so brace yourself for the ride. Number 1. Miracle on the Hudson. On a chilly January day in 2009, the passengers of US Airways Flight 1549 boarded the plane in New York's LaGuardia Airport, unaware of the events that would soon unfold. The plane was bound for Charlotte, North Carolina, carrying 150 passengers and crew members. As the plane took off, everything seemed normal, until a loud thud was heard and the plane shuddered. Suddenly, all the engines stopped and the cockpit was filled with silence. Captain Sully Sullenberger and First Officer Jeffrey Skiles frantically searched for a solution, but it was clear that they would not make it to any nearby airport. The passengers, however, were completely unaware of the danger they were in. Many were engrossed in books or movies, while others were chatting with their neighbors. Suddenly, the cabin crew sprung into action, shouting orders to prepare for impact. As the passengers looked out of the window, they saw a line of birds approaching the plane. They were too close for the pilots to maneuver around, and they collided with the aircraft, causing all of the engines to fail. With no other option, Captain Sullenberger made the decision to land the plane in the Hudson River. As the plane descended, the passengers were instructed to assume the brace position. Although many had flown before, few knew what this meant. As the plane hit the water, it bounced once before coming to a stop. The passengers were shaken, but they quickly realized that they needed to evacuate the plane. They began to make their way to the exits, but the cabin was filling with water and time was running out. Fortunately, the crew had been well trained, and they quickly opened the doors and inflated the slide rafts. The passengers chambered onto the rafts, shivering in the icy water. Many had lost their shoes and coats in the chaos, and they were now completely exposed to the elements. As they floated on the rafts, the passengers began to realize the severity of the situation. They were stranded in the middle of the Hudson River with no way to call for help. The water was freezing, and they were at a risk of hypothermia. But then, to their relief, they saw rescue boats approaching. Within minutes, they were pulled from the rafts and taken to safety. They were brought to a nearby hospital, where they were treated for hypothermia and minor injuries. Despite the severity of the situation, the passengers and crew had survived. They had been forced to rely on their instincts and training to make it through, and they'd emerged stronger for it. In the years that followed, the passengers of Flight 1549 would become known as the Miracle on the Hudson survivors. Number 2. The ditching of US Airways Flight 405. It was a cold March morning when the passengers of US Airways Flight 405 boarded the small Fokker F-28 at LaGuardia Airport in New York City. Most of them were commuting to their jobs, while others were on their way to visit family and friends. The aircraft had just undergone de-icing, a standard procedure to remove any ice or snow from the wings and fuselage, and the passengers trusted that the pilots had taken the necessary precautions for their safety. As the aircraft took off, everything seemed normal, but suddenly, the passengers felt a jolt and heard a loud noise. The plane hit something and it was losing altitude rapidly. Panic set in as the passengers realized that something was terribly wrong. The screams and cries of the passengers were drowned out by the deafening sound of the engines as the pilots struggled to keep the aircraft afloat. One of the passengers, a young woman named Sarah, had been reading a book when the plane crashed. She remembers the chaos and confusion that followed. "It was like a nightmare," she says. "People were screaming, crying, and praying. I felt like I was in a movie, but it was all too real." The aircraft crashed into Flushing Bay, just a few miles from the airport. The impact was violent, and the plane broke into several pieces. The cold water rushed in, and the passengers were submerged in freezing water. The shock of the cold water made it hard for them to move, and they struggled to escape the sinking aircraft. Many of the passengers were injured, and some were trapped in the wreckage. The water was rising quickly, and they knew they had to get out before it was too late. The crew members tried to open the emergency exits, but they were jammed. Passengers tried to help each other, but they were weak and disoriented from the cold. In the chaos, Sarah managed to escape from the sinking aircraft. She remembers the cold water, the darkness, and the feeling of desperation. "I thought I was gonna die," she says. "I was so scared and alone, and I didn't know if anyone else had made it out." Rescue teams arrived quickly, but it was too late for some of the passengers. 27 people had died and many were injured. The survivors were taken to hospitals where they were treated for hypothermia and other injuries. The crash was caused by ice on the wings, a common problem in winter weather. The accident prompted the aviation industry to take a closer look at de-icing procedures and to develop new technologies to prevent ice buildup on aircraft. But for the passengers and the crew members of Flight 405, it was a tragedy that would haunt them for the rest of their lives. Number 3. The ditching of United Airlines Flight 1549. It was a beautiful day in July 1989, and United Airlines Flight 232 was cruising at 37,000 feet over the Midwest. Captain Al Haynes, a veteran pilot with over 30 years of experience, was in control of the DC-10, and his co-pilots were First Officer William Records and Second Officer Dudley Dvorak. Suddenly, there was a loud explosion, and the plane shook violently. A fan disc in the tail engine had disintegrated, severing the plane's hydraulic lines and leaving the crew without any way to control the plane. Captain Haynes quickly radioed for help and began to desperately try to control the plane using only the engines. He asked his co-pilots to help him move the plane, but they couldn't get it to turn. As the plane headed towards Show City, Iowa, the crew knew they were in serious trouble. The passengers, unaware of the danger they were in, were enjoying their flight, but that all changed as the plane began to lurch and shake violently. The cabin was filled with screams of terror as people realized that something was seriously wrong. As the plane descended rapidly, Captain Haynes prepared the passengers for a crash landing. He told them to brace for impact and to hold on to something solid. Many of them clutched their seatbelts, while others held onto their armrests or the seat in front of them. The plane hit the ground hard, and the force of the impact caused it to break apart and burst into flames. The passengers were thrown from their seats, and many of them suffered serious injuries. Those who survived were left dazed and disoriented, unsure of what had just happened. The rescue crews arrived quickly, but the scene was chaotic. The smoke and flames made it difficult to see, and there were injured passengers scattered across the cornfield. The rescuers worked tirelessly to help the survivors, but the scene was overwhelming. In the end, 112 people lost their lives and 184 were injured. The crash was one of the deadliest aviation disasters in U.S. history. For Captain Haynes, the crash was a personal tragedy. He had been unable to save the lives of his passengers, and the memory of the crash haunted him for years. He retired from flying a few years later and spent the rest of his life as a safety consultant for the aviation industry, determined to prevent future tragedies like the one he had experienced. Number 4. The ditching of Ethiopian Airlines Flight 961. It was a beautiful day in November, and passengers were eagerly boarding Ethiopian Airlines Flight 961, excited for their journey to Nairobi, but little did they know that this flight would be their last. As the flight took off, 3 men hijacked the plane, demanding that it be flown to Australia. The pilots tried to negotiate with them, but their demands were not reasonable. The hijackers forced the plane to fly on a southwesterly course, and the pilots did their best to comply while also trying to alert authorities on the ground. But their efforts were in vain. The hijackers soon realized that they would not be able to reach Australia due to a lack of fuel. Panic set in among the passengers as they realized the gravity of the situation. They were flying over the vast Indian Ocean with no hope of a safe landing. As the plane began to descend, chaos erupted inside the cabin. Passengers were screaming and crying, clinging onto each other for support. The impact of the crash was inevitable, and when it came, it was violent and catastrophic. The plane slammed into the sea, breaking apart into several pieces. Those who survived the crash found themselves struggling to stay afloat in the open ocean, surrounded by debris and wreckage. The lucky ones were rescued by nearby fishing boats, while others perished due to injuries or drowning. The survivors were traumatized by the experience, haunted by the memories of that fateful flight. Their lives were forever changed by the events of that day, and they would never forget the horror of Flight 961. So, that concludes our episode today. We'll see you in the next one.